Wow, great to be with you. I want you to turn to Matthew chapter 6. A couple Sundays ago, we did an overall view of Matthew chapter 6. It's the middle chapter of the Sermon on the Mount, and today we want to start on verse 1. We're looking specifically at chapter 6, verse 1 down through verse 4, which is the first paragraph, which deals with the subject of charitable deeds. And we are looking today, introducing that today by looking at verse 1. So let's read in Matthew chapter 6. And if you have your Bibles and can keep them available, we will begin to walk through verse 1 step by step, try to break it down for an understanding. Jesus is speaking. He says, "Take heed that you do not do your righteous deeds before men, to be seen by them. Otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be done in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly." Jesus, we bow in your presence today. We realize these are your words. You probably need to come and somehow immerse us today in this place with your presence and speak these words again to us. Fit them into our culture, fit them into our life, fit them into where we are, fit them into our need, fit them into what we need to hear, and communicate to us. We pray thee today. We open ourselves to that. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Well, my life has been an exciting journey. Back in the day, when I was just coming up, a teenager, I got into this idea of saturation. In fact, we taught a course on it here. But the idea of saturation was not a new idea, not anything unique, not any kind of a new method type thing, but just a concept of absolute focus of your life, saturate. Anything you give yourself to 100%, you're going to be good at. Hey, I was with a coach. It was the first day. This was like in junior high. First day of basketball practice. 40 of us were sitting on the bleachers. Coach walked out. First thing he did, he looked us in the eye and said, "Hey, this ball team will be number one in your life. If you don't want that, there's the door." Well, how do you fit that into Christianity? See, you can't play with Christianity. You can't partial Christianity. You can't come on Sunday morning Christianity. That doesn't work. See, if Jesus is not going to be the total focus of your life, if you're not going to saturate in him, if you're not going to let him have you and you have him, if you're not going to get together with him in a consistent kind of way, then it won't work. It becomes religious deeds. So I got into this saturation idea, saturating in his presence and saturating in his word. So the idea of saturating in his word is not that his word is he is the author of his word, and the way to understand his word is to give him a chance to teach you. So if you say to me, "Do you have a Bible I can understand?" I will say, absolutely not. I do not have a Bible you can understand, because it is not understandable. Because it isn't understandable on the level of a translation. It's understandable on the level of I'm saturating in him and his word, and I'm allowing him, the author who lives within me, to literally do in my mind and in my heart what needs to be done so I can understand what he has to say. Now, as I began to saturate in the word, there was a concept that literally began to be alive in the word itself. In fact, every passage, every paragraph began to emanate, began to elevate, began to show this one single concept. And I ended up calling this concept, and you can call it whatever you want to, but I ended up calling this concept the idea of being. because the Scriptures is constantly talking to us about the being idea. In other words, the state of existence in which you live. In other words, Christianity is about not what you do, but who you are. And I want to make a bold statement to you today, and hopefully no one will misunderstand, and we'll try to clarify. But the bold statement is, Jesus does not care as much about what you do as he does who you are. His focus is not on what you do. His focus is on who you are. Which you realize is a shift, because it's a being state. In other words, you don't do Christian things, you are a Christian. And Christianity is wrapped up in this state of being, which doesn't have doing at the heart of it. There is doing that spills out of it, but the doing is not at the heart of it. It's the state of being, which is a relational concept. Now, so I got into this idea of being, and then the idea of doing, and we're not against doing, obviously, because doing will spill out of this, but you don't start with the doing, you start with the being. So this being idea became alive in my life. Now, I had the opportunity in those days, this was back like in the 1800s, I had this opportunity of holding youth camps, teenagers. So youth camps in the summertime were about 200 teenagers coming to a camp. And, of course, we had a cafeteria. They ate there. They slept there. We had recreation for them. We had all kinds of things going on for a solid week. Teenagers. So I'm going to treat you like a bunch of teenagers today. So these teenagers, I developed this idea of, well, see what happens at a youth camp is they bring all these teenagers, like about 200 teenagers, and then they realize that these teenagers are going to stay up all night. So they decided, rather than have them stay up all night and get into trouble, they would organize the staying up all night. So they had all kinds of activities till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, like throwing water balloons at each other and all this stuff that they would do. And then they would put them to bed, and then they would get them up about 7 o'clock in the morning and bring them down to chapel for morning chapel at 8, and I'm supposed to preach to them. So they're sitting there, the girls are all wrapped up in a blanket, and, I'm supposed to communicate great truth and captivate them. Well, how are you going to do that? Kick them in the teeth. Good. Now, how are you going to do that? There's no way. They act, some of them act like you do. But anyhow, there's no way to communicate to them. So I realized preaching wasn't going to work in that setting. So I developed these discussions which involved them. They had to talk back to me. And we call it the be-in, which emphasizes this concept. And we had some we made signs with bees all over it. Buzz into the be-in and have a honey of a time. Whoa. A little corny, isn't it? Bring your honey to the be-in. So the whole emphasis was on this being concept, trying to communicate to a bunch of teenagers that this is not just about doing religious stuff, but being a Christian at the core and heart of your life. Now, again, we're not against the idea of doing, but see, your whole world is focused on doing. Everywhere you go, the focus is on doing. When you go down to your job, what are they interested? They don't care whether you got a headache or not. Produce. Get the job done. It's all about doing. See, they don't care if you've had an emotional breakdown. They don't care if you've been abused. They don't care about your emotional state. They don't care. Produce. Get the job done. Get the job done. Get the job done. Doing. The whole focus is there. It's your job. Hey, Hollywood is all about what? We don't care about the stars, only that they can perform. Athletics is, can you take the ball bat and hit the ball over the fence? If you can't, hey, we don't care about your home life. We don't care if you're on drugs. We don't care if you're half drunk. If you can get the job done, that's what we're after, the performance. Now, the whole world is that way. Do you think that hasn't infiltrated and come into Christianity, the church? So we preachers have especially latched onto that because we were afraid you wouldn't do. So we emphasize you got to do. You got to come to Wednesday night prayer meeting. You got to come on Sunday morning. You got to give your money. You got to. So we make a list of doing things. So you have ended up with the idea in Christianity that Christianity is all about an activity, a lifestyle of doing things. Now, do you know how radical it is for me to stand here today then and look you square in the eye and say, Jesus does not care as much about what you do as who you are. Now, the danger of that is you will go out of here thinking, misunderstanding, thinking that doing doesn't matter. Oh, Manley said I could do anything I want to. Nobody's saying that. We're saying that the focus is on who you are, and who you are determines what you do. So if you see something in what you're doing, you know where it comes from. It comes from who you are. So you don't change what you do, you change who you are, which changes what you do. So if you don't think different, if you don't feel different, if you aren't different at the core of your life, you're in an uphill battle to stop this doing stuff that you don't want to do. So Jesus' whole emphasis is you've got to somehow move from the doing focus into the being focus and say, hey, at the core of my life, I've got to become who I need to be. Now, when I say you've got to become who I need to be, immediately you think, well, how am I going to do that? See, and we're right back to, because it's really hard to get out of this focus. Now, it's interesting that Jesus' battle with the Pharisees was over in the Gospels, was over this issue. Everywhere in the Gospel, every time he had a confrontation with the Pharisees and the leaders of Israel, this was the battle. Because they had a whole religion that was wrapped up in doing. It was a law structure. And Jesus came and said, hey, we're moving to a new level, guys. We're moving to not what you do, but who you are, which will determine what you do. And he battled this with them. In fact, he looked at them and said, you are whitewashed sepulchres, meaning tombs. See, in Jerusalem, they had like David's tomb, and they honored that tomb. And so they would be whitewashed, and they'd wash it and make it all beautiful on the outside. He said, you're just like that. Open up the tomb. Whoo, dead men's bones. But sure looks nice. He says, that's the way you are. Because in your doing, you have whitewashed the outside, and you look so good in your long robes and your flowing tassels, and you're so, wow, whoa, you're really, wow. But who you are, if we crack you down the middle and go to your inside guts, you're rotten, you're terrible, you smell. He said, you're like a cup. On the outside, oh, it's so clean. On the outside, it's so beautiful. On the outside, but when we look inside the cup, oh, good night. You haven't washed that thing for a year. There's scum, crud, mold. Because you focused on the outside and have forgotten about the inside. See, you're all concerned, he said, about defilement. Hey, I don't want to be defiled. Well, what defiles you? Oh, if the dust from a Gentile gets on me, I'm defiled. If I go into a home that's not right spiritually, I get defiled. So I don't want to be defiled. He said, don't you understand the reality of truth? It's not what comes into the mouth that defiles a man. So it comes out. Think about it. Now again, the danger of this is that you will think I'm saying, hey, doing doesn't matter. It does matter. Because it's the evidence of who you are. So the bottom line measurement of who I really am is what I do. I get that. But I can change what I do and it doesn't change who I am. So if I really want to change what I do, I've got to change who I am. And in changing who I am, that somehow begins to alter Now, that's his whole dynamic and premise in this passage. Now, I want you to go to the verse with me in light of that and look at this first verse. Now, the first verse is, take heed that you do not do your righteous deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven. First verse. Now, he does the first verse which is the pattern for, again, preaching. It's a proposition. In other words, he's going to write this whole chapter. He's going to speak this whole chapter, and all through chapter 6, he's going to introduce the idea of charitable deeds. He's going to introduce the idea of prayer. He's going to introduce the idea of fasting. He's going to introduce the idea of commitment. He's going to introduce 4 issues. Those 4 issues are the 4 issues of all religions. So he's bringing up the subject of religion. And he said, in bringing up the subject of religion, I want to take my message to you and I want to shrink it down to one sentence. And verse 1 is the one sentence. So everything he's going to say in the rest of the chapter can be found in the one sentence. Now, we do that in sermon preparation. We squeeze everything down to one sentence, so the whole sermon is reduced to one sentence. So everything we say in the one sentence for the next hour and a half is all out of that one sentence. Now, most people wish we'd give the one sentence and shut up, but we never do that. So, here's the one sentence of everything Jesus wants to say. Let's look at it. Number 1, practice. What am I to practice in my life? What am I to focus on? What am I to daily engage myself in? What am I to go out of here and say, hey, this is what I'm going to practice getting done in my life? He says it's take heed. Now that's the main verse of the sentence, take heed. And it's an imperative, which means it's a command. So he's literally looking his crowd right in the eye and saying, hey, I'm giving you a command. As sure as there are 10 commandments, here is a command for you. And what is that command? Take heed, which means what? Pay attention. Come on. Hey, pay attention. This is a flag. This is a white flag waving in the face. This is, hey, pay attention. So there's one thing you are to pay attention to. There's one thing you're to give yourself to. There's one thing you are to consistently practice in your life. Don't get off of this day after day after day. Get it down until it just becomes automatic with you. It becomes habitual with you. You just always do this one thing. One thing to pay attention to. Pay attention. Pay attention. Now, what's that one thing? Well, he's given us a premise in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, if you go back to chapter 5, of course, all of this chapter 6 is based on chapter 5. If you go back to chapter 5, he begins this whole thing with the premise of the Sermon on the Mount. It's the Beatitudes. And what is the premise? The premise of the Sermon on the Mount is basically you are poor in spirit. And we discovered that the poor idea is absolutely helpless. You are poor. If I take a knife and slice you down the middle and I go to the inner core of your being, what do I find there? Helplessness. Absolute helplessness. Now you may respond to that by saying, well, I'm not helpless. Look at what I do. See, we're not focusing on what you do. We're focusing on who you are. And when it comes to who you are, who are you? You're absolutely helpless. Now, you're not that way because you've sinned, although you have sinned. But that's not what reason you're that way. You are helpless, because God created you that way. You're supposed to be helpless. See, I was never made by God, created by God, to be sufficient in doing. I was never made by God so I could pull it all off. I was never made by God so I could do everything right. Well, I'm not perfect. I know. God created you imperfect. Intended you to be imperfect. He didn't want a bunch of perfect people. Well, I made mistakes. I know. I've experienced some of them. Just kidding. So, hey, we understand that. Nobody's expecting perfect doing. because that's not the focus. What are we practicing? We're practicing the premise. What is the premise? I'm absolutely helpless, and I'm going to focus my whole attention on my helplessness. Why would you do that? He says in the Beatitudes, so that the overwhelming resource of God could come. This is so phenomenal. And we talk about this all the time, I know. So he could come, and when he comes, he will merge with me. Not pat me on the head, not aid me when I have a need. He would literally come and merge with me. Do you know the reality of the actual presence of God literally involving, literally influencing, literally infusing, literally saturating, literally permeating, literally welded to your being until you and him literally become one activity, one deal. That's his premise. And he says, if that will take place in your life, you will have a righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. Well, what was their righteousness based on? Doing. So I'm giving you a righteousness that's not going to be what you do. I'm going to give you a righteousness that's who you are. Do you realize that takes all the sweat off of it? Do you realize that takes all the pressure off of you? Do you realize this is not anything I have to achieve? This is just who I am. I can't help it. So he's moved us from a righteousness that's accomplished by my doing to a righteousness that comes out of my helplessness because I've merged with somebody who isn't helpless. And in that merger with him, I have literally had a change in who I am. And that's what he's calling it to in the passage. Now he gives 6 illustrations of that in chapter 5. One illustration is, see, they said, don't murder. I can accomplish that. I'm not going to kill you. Jesus said, but let's talk about anger. What? See, I can say I do not do murder, but I can't say I do not do anger, because you don't do anger. You are. I am angry. I know. You don't do it. You are it. Are you with me? So what would happen if I would practice, I would focus on my helplessness and him merging with me? Could something take place in my inner being about who I am that would take me from not just killing people, but not hating them? And it would change who I am. See, the old-timer, second illustration, the old-timer said, I don't cheat on my wife. I don't commit adultery. Pat me on the back. Jesus said, well, how about who you are? See, you don't do lust, you are. Which is not an activity. Oh, it produces activity. Got that. But it isn't an activity, it's who I am. So how am I going to be changed? Well, like, it's not just accountability group. Don't look at pornography. Did you? Are you lying? See, it's not just that. It's could I change at the core of who I am? Could that be changed? He said in marriage, what's marriage all about? He said, the old timer said, well, hey, my wife irritates me and I'll legally divorce her, get rid of her. She's a nag. I get rid of her. Jesus said, what about who you are and what you've caused in her by who you are? Isn't it interesting? Think about this. Isn't it interesting that my wife will forgive me for anything I do, but the final line is, she can't tolerate forever who I am. In other words, I slap her upside the head. She'll forgive me. Take me back. I'll slap her upside the head again. Well, he didn't mean it. He apologized. She'll take me back again. I slap her upside the head. Hey, she forgives me. She'll forgive me. But eventually, who I am, she can't tolerate that anymore. Because this came out of who I am. So marriage then is all wrapped up in not just I do the right thing. Well, good night. I give her money, bought her a car forevermore. Hey, pay the rent. Help us. What more does a woman want? Oh, come on. See, I've got to be right inside. Not just do things, but she wants who I am to be right. Jesus said, oath. Yeah, I take oath, and I have to keep it if God is involved, so I do what I say I'm going to do. He says, what would happen if you would be so immersed with Jesus, so merged with Jesus, so saturated, so submerged with Jesus, so intimate with him, that he was involved in everything you say and do? Wow. That he would produce it all. See, the old-timer, his idea was eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that's fair. What if who you are would be so altered that you weren't involved in just being fair? What you really wanted was to be redemptive and change people's lives, so that you saw everything that was happening to you as an opportunity not to do, but to actually get involved in change for them. So they made you go 1 mile. Fine. Go 1 mile smiling. Go a second mile. Because you've got an opportunity to infiltrate who they are. Not just do something, but infiltrate. See, you look at everything as eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, all about doing. He says, I look at everything as, wow, inward, who you are. Now, he comes to chapter 6 after all of that and says, hey, do you understand? Let's apply this to religion. And I think that's dynamic. Because every religion has these 4 things. Every religion has this generous giving. We all want your money. Every religion has this prayer thing. Every religion has this fasting or spiritual discipline stuff. And every religion has this commitment idea. All religions have those 4 things. Jesus says, I'm not doing away with those. Those aren't bad. We're not talking about them being evil in any sense of the word. It's just that when doing is the focus, you take these 4 things as if something you got to do, and they're not. Because you could do them and not be spiritual. You could do them and it wouldn't mean anything. You can do them and that's as far as it would go. So what I'm calling you to is not just doing religious things. I want you to be. See, you can go to church and not be a Christian as you can go to McDonald's and not be a hamburger. So he says, I want you to practice. So he starts out with, take heed, practice. Moment by moment by moment, focus. This is the one thing you need to get your attention on, which is who you are, not what you do. Now, he moves from the idea of practice, number 1, to the idea of person, number 2, and says, take heed that you do not do. You do not do. Now, the do idea there is the Greek word poieo. And some of you have been involved in that, some of you not, so I got to go through it again. But the poieo word in the original language, which is translated do here, is phenomenal. Because the word is not just doing activities. There is a word for doing activities. It's proso. But poieo is, yeah, it has doing, it has accomplishment, but the accomplishment comes out of the core of the being. It's the word that's used for trees bearing fruit. See, trees don't do fruit. They poieo fruit, which is bear, which is a part of their nature. See, it's the idea that I can't help myself. It's the idea that down deep inside of me is this. It's just who I am. It's just... And he says what I'm after is for a change to take place in what you are deep within. And he says what I want to take place in there, I want your righteousness to be there in who you are, not in what you do. Because righteousness, which is really righteousness, is not a doing thing, it's a state of being in which you dwell. In fact, when you go to the word righteous, which is used in this passage, take heed that you do not do your righteousness, your righteous deeds, your righteousness. It literally means rightness commanded by God. And it never is contained within an activity. It is never, did you get it? It's never contained within an activity. There is no deed involved in being righteous. It is always a state of existence. So nobody can ever say, I go to church, therefore I'm righteous. No, because righteousness is not an activity, a deed that you do. Nobody can say, I pray 5 hours a day, therefore I'm righteous. No, because righteousness is not a deed you do. Righteousness is only contained in this state of being. And nobody is ever righteous unless they are righteous within. That's absolutely essential. Listen to this verse. Paul says, be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Oh. Wouldn't it be great to have a well mind? How you doing? My mind is well. Wouldn't that be great? Oh. He says, be renewed in the spirit of your mind and put on the new man. What's the new man compared to the old man? It has nothing to do with age. New man, old man. The new man is what? This merger thing. Here I am, absolutely helpless. He has come, and a new man is created in that merger. So he says, be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and you put on the new man, which was created according to God in true righteousness and holiness. Ladies and gentlemen, I am not, I've been accused of this, but I am not, people have labeled me with this, I am not a motivational speaker. I hate that. I'm not a motivational speaker. See, this is not a motivational seminar to get me motivated. You don't come on Sunday morning and I pump you up. Come on, folks, let's go, 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 go. See, this is not a cheerleading thing before the ball game. Woo, woo, woo. See, that's not, I am not a motivational speaker, because if I have to motivate you, something out there will unmotivate you. So this is not about motivating you to do more charitable deeds, to do more prayer. Hey, pray more. And we've done that. See, if you will fast and pray, God will. What do you need in your life? How about $10,000? If you'll pray and fast and give me 50. Start with the 50. See, that's not what Jesus is doing here. He's doing the opposite here. So this is not a motivational thing to get you to pray more. It's assumed you're going to pray. He's not trying to get you to do more charitable deeds. It's assumed you're going to give your money. He's not trying to get you to fast and do spiritual discipline. It's assumed you're going to do that. He's not trying to get you committed. It's assumed you're going to be committed. But if you're going to be committed, if you're going to do prayer, if you're going to do charitable deeds, if you're going to do spiritual disciplines, then forevermore, let it spill out of the depth of the insides of who you are. Not an outside pressure of what you have to do. Come on. So he says, I'm talking to you and who you are. So focus Did you get it? Practice. Focus on one thing. Focus on who you are. Focus on what's going on inside of you. Focus on that. And focus on what's in you, not what's in somebody else. Focus on what you are on the inside. Now he moves us to the third idea, which is possession. And this is kind of interesting because he said, take heed that you do not do your righteous deeds. Your. In other words, they're yours. Now that's kind of interesting because that brings me back to the idea of if they're mine, then it's something I do. No, they're not yours in that sense, but there is this phenomenal, how do you describe this? There is this phenomenal combination, this phenomenal coming together, whereby what is his becomes yours and what is yours becomes his. And yes, you are absolutely vital in all of this. See, this is not, Christianity's never been, well, I'm just helpless, so I'm over here in a corner and I'll let God do it all. That's not true. See, this is all that I am, all that he is coming together. See, John the Baptist testified, his testimony was, I must decrease, he must increase. And that's a good testimony for Old Testament. But it's not a New Testament. It's not the New Covenant. See, Christianity is not none of me, all of him. That's not Christianity. Well, Christianity is not all of me and none of him, that's for sure. But it's not none of me and all of him. Christianity is all of me and all of him coming together. See, this is not an elimination of who you are. This is an enhancing of everything you are. This is you becoming the dream that God has had in his heart and his mind all this time. Now, it's interesting in the Bible, it talks about in Hebrews, for instance, where fathers discipline their children. And I experienced that. Back in those days, man, they used the belt. You're too young to know. Wow. They used the belt, and we knew discipline. But sometimes Dad would discipline us because we just aggravated him. It wasn't about us. It was about him. And he beat the living daylights out of us. Because of him, not us. Because I really didn't need it. But he says, listen to this verse. Earthly fathers disciplined as seemed best to them, but God for our profit. That God never, ever, 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 what did I say? Ever disciplined you for himself. It's always for your profit. What's good for you. You can trust him. And when he disciplines you, what does he discipline you for? Listen to this. Fathers, earthly fathers, as disciplined us as seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that for this purpose. The profit is for this purpose, that we might be partakers. You got to get this. Partakers of his holiness, righteousness. That one thing God is after, that we would take on his righteousness. That we would be partners. Now, the word partners there is a phenomenal word because it literally has business involved. And it's literally business partners. It's the idea that, hey, I put into the business, you put into the business, and we are business partners. Now, he's bringing that into our relationship with God. I put into the business, he puts into the business, and we are partners. Well, what's my part? You're helpless. That's what you contribute. Your helplessness, which is who you are. So you give him who you are, helpless. He gives you who he is. And in that combination of business partners, what takes place? Who he is begins to be seen in who you are, and you derive it. You know the idea of derive? I'm out for my morning run. I come home, my wife says, oh. She said, you've been with a skunk. I say, yes. There was running the road. Oh, how did you know? Oh. I derived, I'm not a skunk, and I really don't smell like a skunk. Well, I do, but I derived the smell. See, nobody is holy, nobody is righteous outside of God. Nobody will ever have righteousness outside of Him. Well, if He's the only one that's righteous, then where do I fit into this? Oh, if I could get close enough to Him, I'd begin to smell like Him. It's the old bush thing. You know Moses and the burning bush? And Moses comes up to the bush that's burning and not being consumed. And the voice of God speaks and says, hey, get your shoes off, Moses. You're standing on holy ground. And Moses must have said to God, what are you talking about? This can't be holy ground. I came over this ground yesterday with sheep. You know what sheep do over on ground? This ground is not holy. See, I dig a handful of this dirt and it's under my fingernails. Whoa, it's not holy. It wasn't holy yesterday, boy, but it's holy today. Why is it holy today? Because He is here. And wherever He is, the ground gets holy. What would happen if my helplessness and His overwhelming holiness would literally come together and merge, and we would become one? I would become, I'm not God. No, I derive. I smell like Him. His fragrance begins to, who He is in holiness begins to, I become the state. Do you know how unique that is? Because you are a unique individual. And how many times have I told you this? Your fingerprints are different than anybody else's. Your DNA is different than anybody else's. Nobody looks like you. You are one unique individual. Why would God go to all the trouble for all that trouble for you to make you a unique personality, different than anybody else, so that His righteousness could merge with the uniqueness of who you are, and a unique demonstration that nobody else can give in the whole world would begin to flow out of you. See, Christianity has never been a cookie-stamped idea where we have a production line and they all dress alike, act alike, move alike. This is the uniqueness of each individual somehow merged with God until what He does in and through you is so significant, because nobody else can pull that off. That's what He's talking about here. Focus, practice, focus on what? Who you are. Focus on who you are. Why? So that His righteousness can literally be seen and demonstrated in and through your life. Who wouldn't want that? Jesus, it's just so ironic, God, that everything I've worked like a dog to pull off in my life, you want to give me. Everything that my heart has just longed for and desired and desperately needs, that I've stretched my muscles, I've tried to discipline myself, I've done everything I can do to pull it off. I've prayed more, I've fasted more, I've given more, I've done all this religious stuff, I've been at the altar, I've done all this stuff, God, to try to pull this off and be, and you want to give it to me. I've gone through 12 steps, and you want to give it to me. In the name of Jesus, could you, Jesus, would you, not could you, would you? And why wouldn't you? Would you just descend on us? Would you just permeate this place? Would you just go to the depth of each one of our lives? Would you just immerse us in yourself in this moment? And would you just pull us out of the trying to try to get it done, focused on doing it, and would you bring us into the embrace of your person, who will change who I am. Because you have come. Heads are bowed. Why is that so hard for you? Because all of these years you've been trained in doing. What we're inviting you to, would you step out of that thought process, out of that framework, out of attempting, out of the self-centered activity that builds your pride because you accomplished it? And would you get on your face and admit you're helpless and let him do something in you and change who you are? All that you are, all that he is, coming together. Wow. What an opportunity. So our altar's open. And realize, please, realize the cost of this. See, it's not just flex your muscles and lift weights so you can be strong. It's not just discipline yourself so you can pull it off. There's a cost in that, I get that. But that's cheap. That's cheap compared to this. Because what it takes for him to give all that he is to you was a cross and the blood process and all that went on in Jesus. That's the cost. It cost him down to himself. So he's asking you this morning to match that by giving all you are, because he's given all he is. And this new thing, who you are, can be changed. Moments of seeking. Be obedient. Our altar's open.